How important is the information system to the valuation of a company? At Ultra, we're seeing an increasing number of firms implement new information systems as part of a growth and exit strategy. So how should we evaluate the information system and its impact on value? So what's needed when evaluating a business process? Let's look at ways to understand and evaluate an information system and its business processes. Your first step is the documentation and analysis of the current state. So what's the current state? What do I mean by that? The current state is a description of your business processes as they exist today. Everyone is using some form of a formal system. It is this formal system which we want to document and evaluate. This activity should be done with the company's business process experts. On the next few slides, I'm going to show you some examples of documenting the current state. This first list is the typical functions that we see in a manufacturing company. The processes cover all of the information functions we typically see in a manufacturer. So when we're talking about looking at the information system, we're not just looking at maybe just functionalities that just exist in the incumbent system. We're looking at all of the processes, Excel, Word, all of the business processes that exist within that manufacturing company.
You know, Jeff, when we look at this list, one of the words that comes to mind is silos. And it's something that we look at when we go into companies and ask them to describe themselves, and they list out these functions. And a function is a little bit different than a process. So what we really have here is a list of functions, and I'll kind of build on that as we go ahead.
Thanks, Rich. Now I'm showing you typical functions we see in manufacturing. The processes cover all of the information functions we typically see in a manufacturer. We've got to organize these into groups. And Rich can comment on, these different groups of applications and what they mean.
So when we start looking at a company, to really drive the improvement, we've got to look at how the processes integrate, or the functions integrate with each other into a process. So what we like to do is to first just understand what's the value stream within the company, and then which functions are contributing in what sequence to that value stream. And we'll organize those functions into major processes that we call things like quote to cash or order to cash. So within quote to cash, order to cash, we're issuing a quote, taking an order, making the delivery, collecting the cash. Within procure to pay, how do we know what to buy? What do we buy? How do we receive it? How do we pay for it? Right. So to deliver the compelling value, we've got to look at how these processes, these functions are working together in terms of an integrated process or not working. And so that's what we're trying to do with this level 0, is just at a high level, what's the business model and how are the functions integrated into these processes or not integrated?
This next slide shows us what we call a supply chain map. This map helps us understand how the company operates with its suppliers and customers.
Yeah, so here, the more complex the supply chain, either in terms of diversity of supply, or the more complex in terms of the number of customer types and or distribution channels, the more complexity there is in the business. So we've got to look at not just the inside of the company, but how they fit in the ecosystem of the supply chain to see what kind of dependencies and what types of business scenarios are being inflicted into the company, either from the suppliers or what type of requirements are coming forth based on the distribution channels and customer types.
Lastly, I'm going to show you an inventory of all business processes. Think of this as a table of contents for all of the maps and diagrams of the business processes within the company. As I mentioned before, we're looking beyond just the incumbent system. We're looking at all business processes, regardless of whether it's the legacy system or whether it's a departmental system. We need to pull it all together and start to look at it and dissect it and analyze it as a whole set of business processes for the company, so that we can evaluate it as to its fit to best practices in the industry.
So out in the public domain are standardized process models in terms of, as you look at a company, and how the company is described within these major processes like quote to cash or procure to pay. There are a subset of processes that are a standard model, and we've taken that within Ultra and have adapted it and expanded on it based on our targets into manufacturing and distribution. But the idea is that we want to take these sub processes and map them into which systems are being used to execute those processes, and to the degree that those systems are enabling us to jump across those functional silos, the better. Where they're inhibiting, that's important to understand too. And all this ultimately is going to come together in terms of how do we drive value in the company.
On this next chart, I've got a list of business functions, and we've shown you a couple of different variations of that. But what I want to point out to you is that as time has gone on and ERP systems have evolved, there is something that I call core ERP. Orders, purchase orders, work orders, inventory movements, deliveries, invoices, etc. But on the next chart, what you see is a more integrated look. And this is where systems have evolved over time. So we're going to dissect this for a few minutes. I want to look at these particular pieces. What we've seen is the integration of what we'll call CRM, and I'll explain that in a minute, WMS, MES, PLM with finance and supply chain. So let's look at these different ellipses and the different components that are within these, and kind of describe some of the issues that you have. So on the left, we see SCM, and that stands for supply chain management. And that's where you have the forecasting, the advanced planning, your typical MRP and MPS type applications. To the right, you see CRM, and more systems now have complete CRM systems integrated with what we used to call core ERP. And in CRM, of course, you've got Salesforce automation, contact management, telemarketing, and e-commerce has evolved. And as you see some customer-facing applications such as configurators, customer service, and different functions in that particular area. And then we get into the WMS, the warehouse management system. We see shipping and receiving and inventory control, barcoding, and the logistics applications. We see on the left the FMS, the finance management systems. And a couple of new things that you may or may not be aware of is that the advancement of what we call PLM, or product lifecycle management, which is designed to enable engineering business processes. And then MES, which is manufacturing execution systems. And when we talk about Internet of Things, this is the typical area where we see a lot of that activity, where we get machines talking to the ERP systems. So this is what you're going to see as eventually companies wanting to move to a completely integrated system, really covering all of the advanced applications within a typical manufacturing business.
So when we look at improvements and evolutions of business models, in particular, like with our manufacturing base, quite often we're seeing companies that wish to go more of a direct-to-consumer route in addition to their traditional, 1-2-step distribution models. And as they do that, and you look at, say, the quote to cash process, and just kind of think that through, how a customer is informed of a price through e-commerce, how you take an order, ship an order, is dramatically different than how you would do that with a more traditional distribution model. And so then when you look at the breakdown of systems within companies, we'll quite often see like one e-commerce system interacting with another system, which is taking an order, and then a warehouse management system, which is shipping the order. So as all this stuff is coming together into a kind of a common platform, the easier it is to adopt some of these innovative business models. But e-commerce still, to be frank, is lagging out there in terms of roll-up, and we're seeing a lot of work, a lot of opportunity for growth, but at the same time, a lot of requirements for business change around e-com.
So let me address the question of why analyze your current state. I've had a lot of vendors particularly kind of take issue with me on some of these things. Let's just go right to the future state. Well, my answer is that if you don't understand the current state, how can you possibly create the proper future state for the business. But in looking at the current state, it's very important to look at that, to understand the issues and the opportunities, to address the needs for change, to inventory all of the processes and data, and to compare it to best practices. And while doing that, we have typically, in comparing it best practices, used something we call the business process maturity model. To introduce that concept, I'd like Rich to talk about the business process maturity model.
So we've talked about the quote to cash and the procure to pay and the plant to produce. So these like major processes. But when you look at the process, there's a doing it well, doing it okay, or doing it poorly kind of a continuum on these processes. But we need some kind of a definition of what is really good for quote to cash, what is really good for procure to pay, and how much benefit is there to achieve that, right? So to go from not very good to extremely good for a particular process, there's an investment that's required, and there's a value to that. And so what we're about is trying to get these high-level quote to cash, procure to pay processes broken down into some descriptive models that we can then compare our clients to and say, here's the gap, and not just tell me what you think you can improve, and this is what we think we can improve. We want to look at it from comparing it to a prescriptive model. And it's interesting, as you break it down, we can actually score it, and we use something called the CMMI model, which you can find in Lean Six Sigma. But that CMMI model, we actually will go through and break down quote to cash, procure to pay, and actually kind of rank from a 1 to a 5 scale each of the elements of quote to cash, procure to pay, design, deploy, and feed that back to, so say you're looking at a company from an acquisition perspective, we'll actually give you a score in terms of what is the maturity level in each of these processes, so that you can understand what investments would be need to be made to improve the capability, and what's the corresponding business case around that. So out in Lean Six Sigma is this capability maturity model, and we've actually kind of built that out for quote to cash, order to procure to pay, et cetera. And it starts at the real basic level of level 1, and this is again the Lean Six Sigma definition, but level 1 ad hoc. These are where processes are unpredictable, poorly controlled, and reactive to managed, where we're getting a little bit better understanding, and we actually have well-defined. And by and large, the majority of the clients that we go in to help fall kind of in this level 2 with a little bit of level 1, occasionally up into level 3. It's pretty rare that we see level 5 type of processes in terms of dramatic investment in technology, continuous improvement, and just really cutting edge capabilities. Where organizations are doing these, they tend to be industry leaders. So, for example, we have a client that does aftermarket truck accessories, and as we went in, we actually did a high-level capability assessment with them, and we broke it down into not just the processes like we're talking about, but also leadership, culture, and technology. And if you think about it in terms of looking at a potential transaction, this is potentially a way to kind of look at that in terms of how mature is the leadership, how mature are the processes, how mature is the culture, how mature is the technology. And in this case, they were in pretty good shape from a leadership perspective, process, culture, technology, pretty typical where we would see things around a 2. And so then the idea is that we had a conversation with the management team, and all this went into much more detail than I'm going to show you here, but we had conversations with the management team in terms of which of these areas do you really want to make a meaningful investment through this transformation, and what target do you want to get to? And so we worked with them in terms of, so today, for example, your leadership team, we're categorizing it as a 2. What would be required to get it up to a level 3? And we broke that down into, well, let's talk about the business plan, vision, and strategy. That was fairly immature. The executive commitment was there, but more of a lip service than putting action behind it, and they needed a lot of work to do in terms of bringing in and building up a project management capability. So we viewed these as kind of the critical success factors within leadership. Then we looked at their processes, and I've talked about that a little bit in terms of that CMMI process model, and we actually broke this down to another level and gave them a score around their procure to pay, plan to produce, et cetera. You know, and for the most part, their processes were documented, but they were siloed. So they had systems that were supporting specific functions within the process, but they weren't well connected. And so their master files were kind of a mess. And there was a lot of kind of a batch orientation to the company, which resulted in delays in terms of being able to access information, to be able to push up customer service capabilities. And they didn't really even know how well they were doing because their key performance measures were kind of ad hoc and inconsistently applied across the processes. So again, so the transformation plan was to basically improve through the process that Jeff talked about of doing a current state, going through an envisioning exercise, defining a future state, but also transforming the business to look at it from a process management perspective. So let's look at procure to pay as a unit instead of purchasing as a unit, receiving as a unit, accounts payable as a unit. Let's set up KPIs around those integrated processes and start to adopt more of a process management framework than just a straight siloed functional framework. And then to take them through this kind of a transformation, because that is a pretty substantial change to look at things from a business process management perspective versus a functional, we needed to make sure that we understood the culture, the management, and where they were at. And for the most part, the company had kind of an awareness with a little bit of a modest general understanding. And so what we needed to do was to put in place a change management strategy to take them kind of through this curve and to aggressively manage that throughout the transformation. So culture maturity, and so we've got a good description in terms of what culture maturity looks like. In this case, they had multiple failures to change in the past, and with that failure to change, that creates kind of some angst and some apprehension to the change. Again, so we appointed some business process owners, super business process owners, procure to pay, plan to produce, process owners that then needed to articulate the expectation across the functions to get everybody on board to move ahead. So change, adoption, communication, education, training were all factors. And then lastly, to achieve a meaningful transformation in the company, we needed to assess the IT environment. And here they were pretty problematic in a lot of areas, very, very reactive, didn't have good standardized operational procedures within IT. Their IT governance was poor. And this was an area that they really needed to make some substantial investments in an aggressive way to get them to where they needed to be. So kind of thinking ahead, as you go in to assess improvement opportunities within an organization, you want to look at it across each of these dimensions and come up with a maturity score, and then try to quantify what's the value of moving from a 1 to a 2 or a 2 to a 3, so that you can appropriately build a business case and channel investments. So throughout all this, master data is extremely important, in particular when you've got situations where we're putting multiple companies together, or on the flip side, we're going to need to carve out companies. So I'm going to talk about a business case in which two companies were pulled together and they were selling into a common set of customers, but to achieve all the to market strategies that were identified during the due diligence and acquisition, they needed to move to a common item master and a common customer master, so that their customers viewed them as one entity and not two. And so that's a lot of work, and the larger the SKU counts, the larger the customer counts, that's a whole set of investments that's not always in particular looked at, but it ends up being a real bear to get your arms around. So having a maturity score on the IT on the data master data files is real important as well.